All right, so it's a pleasure to have you here, Anna and Isaac, for our webinar about the fundamentals of decentralized clinical trials, DCTs, specifically talking about strategy and execution. It's a newly published book, which I had the pleasure of reading over the past week, and provided a lot of really important insights into the landscape of DCTs, past, present, but most importantly, future, as Isaac told me backstage just a few minutes ago. I will properly introduce you in a moment, but just some housekeeping items. We will have a full hour today of this webinar. A quick introduction of the speakers, also of the sponsors of the webinar, modality very briefly, and then of course we're looking forward to an brief overview of the book that I just showed, as published by Springer. And then we will, as usually in these webinars, go into a vivid conversation where we talk about some of the learnings, some of the specific topics that the book addresses in these various chapters before we wrap up around 11 o'clock Pacific. So let me just get started setting a little bit of the stage. As I mentioned, Modality sponsors these webinars. We are strong users of decentralized clinical trials. What we do is we address one of the major pain points of clinical drug development, which is that drug trials are failing. We are addressing this specific issue by using a virtual guide, specifically in trials of neurological and psychiatric conditions, that is provided in a decentralized fashion to individuals, direct to participant in their own home. This virtual guide actually interviews patients in a way that is similar to what a psychiatrist or neurologist would do, and we can tell from what patients say and do, their speech, their language, facial movements, body movements, and so on, how they function and feel, which is very important for the regulators and for the drug developers to understand. And that happens on people's own devices, your laptop, your smartphone, your iPad, all essentially essential components of direct-to-participant or decentralized clinical trial execution. We work with sponsors of clinical research, big pharma, biotech companies, and also the federal government in many different disease areas, as you can see here, neurology, psychiatry, different stages of trials, observational all the way through phase 3. We will talk about specific implications of DCTs in different types of trials throughout our conversation today. But I don't want to hold us up too much before introducing our esteemed speakers today. Anna Yang, she is the principal of clinical innovation technology at Genentech, right around the corner from here in South San Francisco. She had a number of former roles at Genentech, for example, as a medical science director of digital health, so very relevant to what we do at Modality, but DCTs as well, as a postdoctoral fellow also at Genentech. Also as adjunct faculty and preceptor at Rutgers University, and so also in an oversight role over there, pharmacy intern at Walgreens, and also internships at other pharmaceutical companies, most notably Bristol Myers Squibb and Regeneron, the doctor of pharmacy from Rutgers as well, worth mentioning. Thank you very much for making time today. It is a pleasure talking about decentralized trials with you and with Isaac Rodriguez-Chavez, who many of you probably know from his former roles at the FDA and the NIH, but also in industry, of course. So as a former senior vice president, scientific and clinical affairs, and most importantly, head of decentralized clinical trials in digital medicine at ICON, one of the biggest CROs in the world. But then also from the perspective of the agency, which is an important component of what we will talk about today. What do the regulators say about DCTs, about digital health technology and other these components? He was the FDA officer for clinical research methodology, regulatory compliance, and medical policy development, and also played many roles at the National Institute of Health, for example, as a director of the AIDS immunosuppression program and several other programs as well, as part of the NIAID, NCI, and NIA. So he knows many of the different departments of the agency very well. PhD from University of Delaware, And I don't want to list all the other affiliations and accomplishments here. We will dive now into the book, and I want to hand over to Anna and Isaac to give us a little overview of the book itself. And I will advance the slides here, and then we move into the conversation.
Thank you so much, DSO, and it's a privilege to be here. I'm so delighted to have this conversation with you all, and really humbled to be joined by Isaac. As you can see, he's got so many accolades and experiences. So when I was a younger researcher to the clinical trials world, I just knew I had to work with him. So really happy and humbled to be working with Isaac on this book and bringing this knowledge alignment to the field. Really quick disclaimer is that both Isaac and I represent our own companies, and everything we say here today is really expressing our own opinions and that does not reflect those of our participating companies and affiliations. So this is going to be a really, casual conversation. Feel free to chime in with any questions, but just to level set a little bit, when I first worked in this space, it was around 2019, 2018, before COVID. A lot has changed since then. And one of just the basic reasons I wanted to do this was really to provide a biography overview of how DCTs evolved over time, and then provide like a basic fundamental handbook, easy to read handbook for future researchers. So it's really short, just 5 quick chapters. Isaac and I are the volume co-editors, but we do have experts that also contributed in various chapters as well. Isaac, do you want to chat a little bit about that?
Yes, indeed. So thank you, Anna, and thank you, David, and welcome all of you colleagues online attending to this webinar. We're truly excited to be here with all of you today. And I would say it's an equal honor and pleasure to be here with all of you and to have shared this activity and very important book for the field at large with Anna and our contributing authors. One thing that David didn't mention about me is that at the present time, I am an independent consultant in the same space of scientific affairs, clinical research, regulatory affairs, and digital medicine. And that is leveraging the expertise that I have had and built over the years. This book really is our inspiration because of the rapid growth and adoption of DCT approaches in recent years, and also the need for a comprehensive guide on implementing DCTs effectively. We wanted to be a voice for those interested in decentralized clinical trials who really doesn't have the expertise and the knowledge, but needs to cover the basics. We're talking about young professionals or professionals interested overall in joining this field, students and the like, because it's a one-on-one basic content for everyone to be aligned as to what it means adopting and designing decentralized clinical trials and approaches. So that is the main inspiration. And as you can see, it's a short book. The intention is really to be easy to digest, easy to process. This is our beginning book. We are planning to continue with the next iteration of this series. And so we have covered different things that we will discuss in a bit. So back to you, Anna, to start with the chapters.
Yes, and thank you. Just to add on as well, so with any evolving space, it's really hard to gather the right information because things are changing so quickly. So even throughout the process of writing this book, we had to re-edit and edit and edit again just to make sure the content was relevant. And by the time we published it, it would actually be still true. And so in any space, you have the leading indicators and lagging indicators. So we really tried to harness the lagging, which would be more the peer-reviewed manuscripts, the data that comes out from large organizations like the Tufts Center for Excellence, Center for Drug Development, as well as DTRA. So the first chapter goes into the evolution, which gives a little overview of what happened before COVID and what kind of the need. So as you know, clinical trials are really costly and burdensome to run. There's about a huge dropout rate, around 50% of patients will drop out, and 1 in 5 patients will actually really be lost to follow-up as well. So in this situation, we wanted to provide key kind of core metrics around what makes this trial need change. So we wanted to capture the diversity and inclusion kind of needs, as well as the cost burden, the time burden, the sponsor kind of front of mind concerns as well that provided the perfect storm, I guess, to really shake up the field and therefore require the trial to be more modernized and easy for patients to really participate in. Chapter 2 goes into the technology. So as you know, there's a lot of technology within enrolling a patient through e-consent, maintaining the randomization, IXRS, looking at the ECOA requirements, the wearable requirements, the regulatory standards, all these things. And so providing a basic understanding of what each technology component really requires and how they play together is what chapter 2 is all about. Then regulatory, I'm going to hand it to Isaac because he's our regulatory guru.
So again, the regulatory component is really putting into perspective the regulatory framework that existed at the time for supporting the design and the implementation of decentralized clinical trials across therapeutic areas. And so we, at the time, discussed the draft guidance on decentralized clinical trials wasn't published. That's the one that I contributed to, among others. And that guidance was published after the book came out as a final guidance. So it's a matter of timing, but the content, the main content that is in alignment with the DCT guidance from the FDA, the EMA position on decentralized clinical trials is reflected here in terms of the regulatory landscape and what considerations should be taken into account for designing and implementing these trials. Back to you.
Awesome. Yeah, and then chapter 4 really goes into how do you execute and write up a trial with a decentralized trial element in it. So it gives a kind of walkthrough of, for example, what are you trying to achieve from a medical gap standpoint? What are some elements of flexibility you can write inside? How do you calculate the return on your implementation? So what does feasibility mean? Things like that. And then chapter 5 goes into tracking impact. And this is such an important conversation right now because with DCTs and actually any sort of evolving innovation in trials, leadership really wants to know what is the impact of doing such novel exploration onto our enrollment rate, onto our efficiency of doing the trial. Are we actually enrolling a broader population? Is there a trade-off in terms of less data quality, things like that? Also, really important topics like burnout in the healthcare system. So can we actually optimize the existing infrastructure of our research staff to do more work with less effort? So things like that, that's what chapter 5 goes into. And I hope that, with everyone's minds today, we can continue to iterate on the content of this book for future versions so that the whole field can move forward together without feeling left behind or feeling confused, because this is really, we really require all stakeholders to be bought in and believe in the future to modernize clinical research so that we can really bring access to medicines to patients that desperately need them.
So a couple of things, let me add here a couple of things in regards to the content. Overall, this again is a practical guidance on designing, conducting, and reporting decentralized clinical trials in the full and hybrid formats. It represents the best practices for incorporating remote elements of decentralization into clinical research. It showcases some key case studies on DCT implementations and considerations, and evidently it covers the key regulatory considerations and challenges for the execution of these decentralized clinical trials. What are we trying to accomplish here? What are our goals? Really, our most important goal is to serve all of you and to provide a valuable resource for clinical research professionals who wants to transition and implement decentralized clinical trial models. We want to promote the wider adoption of patient-centric technology-enabled clinical trial approaches, modern clinical trials approaches, decentralized clinical trial approaches, and we want to improve the clinical trial efficiency, aiming to reduce costs, enhance really those efficiencies, and enhance the patient participation and experience across these decentralized clinical trials. This is very much patient-first, patient-focused, patient-centric approaches that actually are supposed to embrace all of us, regardless of our geographies. Thank you. Anna, back to you.
Yes, I just also want to add another thing to that is I feel that the work that we did this because selfishly, I feel that in the future, if I ever had to go on a clinical trial, knock on wood, I wouldn't want to have to drive so far just to do the basic tests. It doesn't make any sense. Why would I have to give up even more time out of my life and my caregiver, life to do things that don't have to be done so far away? So I just wanted to be one of the, elements of people in the space to bring this into reality so that medical care is more practical and not so clunky and burdensome and just overly complex. So that requires a lot of, upfront effort to set this infrastructure up. And that's why this book was so important, to gather all the information so that people know what it is and what it's not, and be, bought into where the space is headed. That's it. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And that actually brings me to one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, which is about your inspiration and actually the history of coming up with the idea, hey, we should put a book together. Is that Springer came to you, asked, you're expert in this field, can you write about it? Or was it more the personal inspiration, like what you just said, Anna, to push this out?
Absolutely. So I've always been really inspired by Roche and Genentech being one of the leaders of scientific publishing. So we, Genentech, published the book about DNA, about like unprovoked maladies, and we just have a strong track record of being literary, like creatives, if you will. And so being part of that community really made me want to be part of that as well. So that's the first thing, is being proud of where I work at Roche, just a quick plug. But also, when I was learning about this space, I felt like there was a lot of, white papers and blogs and interesting articles that were a little bit conflicting. And I started just naturally writing down on a Google Doc, like, what do we know to be undebatably true? So even at the time, we didn't know that decentralized trials were really the name of it. So I didn't put that in there, but I put the need is the patient, geographical constraints. The need is the need to enroll a broader population. This is the data that actually shows what metric is the one that everyone's talking about. And so after putting together these bullet points, I realized that this could be potentially useful for people to onboard with. So I was sharing it with my coworkers and colleagues. And then a little bit after that, I realized maybe like this should be helpful for everyone else outside of Roche. So I submitted a little proposal to Springer, didn't expect anything to come out of it, but then they quickly came back to me a week and a half later, really, and said, we like your idea, please work on an actual book. And then I was like, I actually have to get through this work now. I need to have a really good thought partner. I need to have someone that can also balance the ideas going into this book, because as I mentioned, with any evolving space, you might put information in there that is still evolving and debatable. So I wanted to have a good balance of expert leadership and thought, and someone that's really been leading the space, which is why I invited Isaac, and he graciously accepted to be my partner in crime on this project.
Yeah, so I would say the experience is kind of parallel. In my case, I joined the FDA. I was an FDA senior official, and one of the main tasks was really to lead a program on decentralized clinical trials, to write guidance on decentralized clinical trials, to assist in the writing of a program and guidance on digital health technologies and all aspects connected to the modernization of clinical trials, including even real-world evidence, use of electronic clinical outcome assessments, and so on and so forth, digital health technologies, like I said. So I had the privilege and honor, true honor, of working with a brilliant supervisor and colleagues who make this possible. And so together, we were presented with the challenge of, yes, we have the gold standard, randomized controlled trials, but there have been a history of deficiencies in the gold standard. How can we address that? And though decentralized clinical trials are not new, they were not really fully implemented and embraced by the industry and the field at large. What can we do? Well, evidently, the FDA is responsible to guide the field in addition to their mandate on public safety for medicine, cosmetics, and foods. So we put together the program on decentralized clinical trials, on digital health technologies, that really is under the larger umbrella of modernization of clinical trials. And the rest is history, because I have been evangelizing decentralized clinical trials from the very beginning. within the regulatory agency, outside of the regulatory agency, interfacing the industry, and so on and so forth. I got to meet wonderful colleagues and friends. Example of those, and leaders, example of those is Anna, whom is a very close friend and colleague, and she adopted the ideas, embraced the ideas, and was willing to work with me to implement not only the book, but the creation of use cases and being the voice out there to help harmonize the field, to help everyone so that we can actually be a source of help and hope and information so that collectively we can actually move forward the field. Why? The benefit really is on the side of the patient and thinking about the patient. And yes, there is a benefit for the sponsors, and yes, there is a benefit for every single stakeholder that engages in this type of clinical investigation. So there is everything to win here, and those have been the source of inspiration, motivation, and going forward, they continue to be the inspiration and the reasons why we are working together.
It's really interesting to say this, and you mentioned, of course, the historic changes and historic implications. In the book, for example, you go into the impact that the COVID epidemic had on accelerating the adoption of methods that are DCT inspired. And of course, there's different, and you mentioned that before also, there's different types of DCTs. There's what we call full DCTs, which is like entirely remotely conducted clinical research studies. And there's one that are hybrid, where there's still a combination of on-site visits, for example. I would really love to see or hear from you what actually the definition is of a DCT, and also how this breaks down with respect to how you see this today. How many studies are actually being run as full DCTs versus hybrid? Are there actually even traditional studies today? I mean, ones that do not use any DCT methods at all? Do you see this today? So what's the overview of the landscape?
So let me start, and then I will pass it on to Anna for additional comments. I can tell you that decentralized clinical trials were started in early 2000s, so they are not new. The pre-pandemic adoption was really small in the single percentages, say 6 to 7% in early 2000s. In the 2014 and above, it continued increasing. But pre-2020 overall, about 38% or even less of the biopharmaceutical CRO companies were expected to implement DCT as a major part of their portfolios in clinical research. Then COVID-19 happened, and it was a tragedy worldwide for the amount, the quantity, the number of people that died, a very painful experience. But at that moment, the best of that bad situation was that about 93% of the trials had to be rescued, and the way to rescue them was implementing elements of decentralization. So about 85% of the trials transitioned to remote activities during the pandemic. And this was all governed by, for example, the implementation of telehealth in phase 3 clinical trials, and so on and so forth. Post-pandemic, there was a decline and there was a burned out effect because of the sudden implementation of decentralized clinical trials. Many organizations actually reverted back to traditional methods of using traditional trials as opposed to decentralized elements or so. And in 2004, and it was expected to leverage to go down. And in 2004, the surveys show about 1,400 DCTs were expected globally. That represented about 6% increase compared to the previous year, 2023. Phase 2 trials dominated in 2024 in terms of DCT approaches, and that represented about 50% of all DCTs conducted across therapeutic areas. The market growth has been impressive and continues to be impressive. The market size reached about $7 billion in 2024. That was an increase from about $5 billion in 2023. The academic and the nonprofit sponsors became drivers also of the growth that has been experienced in decentralized clinical trials. And the industry continues to adopt these solutions. This is an expansion of the clinical research toolkit. This is not a replacement of randomized controlled trials. So the market projections from 2025 this year until 2035, going forward into the future outlook, there is an expected growth of about 11%, reaching about $20 billion by 2035. Mind you that I just said about $7 billion in 2024 is the estimate market growth, and that can go as high as, again, 20 billion. So at least 2 or 3 times more than what exists at the present time. Evidently, this is driven by multiple factors. There is a regulatory momentum on this. The FDA, the EMA, the Canadian health agency, regulatory agencies are playing and have played a major part in providing guidance, in accepting data, clinical data for new medical products that include elements of decentralization, innovative patient-centric demand and approaches. 94% of the patients are really preferring the use of their own devices, for example, in clinical investigations. The reduction in the reduction in the travel that represented a burden, and that actually represents an improvement in enrolling patients from everywhere, geographically speaking, is a major advantage. There is still a trend in trying to optimize cost along as part of the optimization of efficiencies. This is something that is in the works, but the preliminary data shows anywhere between 10 to 30% reduction in trial cost, fewer sites, more efficient sites, remote monitoring for patient safety and for the trial conduct. Evidently, all of these approaches are enabled by technology and the technological advances that have been put in place. Wearables, mobile apps, telehealth, and so on are important elements to collect the data in real time and to analyze data and to react more quickly than ever before. The regulatory support, I mentioned the FDA guidance that I helped to provide to the public. But there are still challenges. This is a transformation. This is part of the digital modernization transformation that the clinical research field is experiencing. And as any adoption, there are some challenges. There are still some regulatory ambiguities. There is still concerns about the digital divide. There are still hurdles connected to the operational complexities because this requires a really different skill set to be able to implement these trials. And so it's just not retrofitting a randomized controlled trial, for example. Really, you have to change the way that you think about even protocol design to do this effectively. There are training gaps and training burned out sites connected to this. So there are some challenges. Nothing is black or white, but we are going in the positive direction. And this is a very exciting moment to be in the clinical research field implementing these approaches. Back to you, Anna.
Absolutely. And I want to ask you about your experience at Genentech. You mentioned Genentech is one of the, of course, most innovative biotech companies that we know of, and specifically also, I suppose, in the adoption of digital technologies like DCTs. Are you aware of any trials right now that, for example, at Genentech or other companies that you're aware of that do not use any DCT components, at least? And
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I also want to piggyback to what Isaac beautifully said just now about the current state. And yes, it is a very big privilege to be working in the way of advancing and modernizing clinical research. So I'm very happy and lucky to be able to experience all this. Where we're currently at is the field will not really go into fully virtual. I think that's a little bit too far away. Also, I think depending on the patient population, some patients like to go into sites, but not for all visits. So the magic really is in the hybrid approach, and then doing like a fit for purpose kind of DCT implementation depending on your population, the research question, the rigor of the data needed to collect, the type of data you want to collect, where it's coming from, what technologies are being used, if you have it collected in the home setting or in a local HCP facility setting or at the site always. So a lot of different nuances, which is complicated right now to say, but it really will come magically easy when you have a cross-functional team working together. One thing I've noticed, Dave, DSO, did you want to say something to that? I saw you unmute.
No, go ahead.
Okay. One thing I will say is I'm noticing that sites are actually asking for DCT or flexible type approaches now. So in my recent meetings, even ex-US, there's a Paris site, and then also there's a bunch of sites in the Latin American areas that actually have a preferred vendor now that do local HCP type remote follow-up visits for oncology patients even. So that's something that is also really interesting, because with DCT adoption, it was more in the neurology space, chronic care diseases, things like that. But for oncology, it was really difficult to have a use case for DCT elements. But then with these experiences recently, these cancer sites have patients that have been on drug, are stable, and don't want to come back in for these basic limited physical exams and labs and things like that. So the site is asking us as a sponsor if we can implement some sort of flexible infrastructure for them where they can use a vendor or use a home health nurse to kind of enable that. So I was very happy to hear that change. And I think that's where the space is evolving, is not just the sponsor, but also has to come from the site being willing and bringing up the topic of decentralized elements in the protocols.
Yeah, the example that you gave really illustrates the spectrum on which we operate, right? So we have the traditional trials, and I'm wondering whether there's any trial that is not using any electronic components at all nowadays. Maybe there are still, but many are shifting into using some digital components, whether it's e-consenting or whether it's patient follow-up or any communication that is happening through or any platforms that are being used already to communicate between the sites and the patients, all the way to fully decentralized trials. There's not that many. We are actually part of one, which is it's a device trial for Parkinson's disease that is a phase 3 study actually in Parkinson's, as I mentioned. And
let me chime in 1 second here, David. I just wanted to complement what Anna just mentioned.
Go ahead.
I agree with Anna in that right now the trend is really goes into the majority, and I mentioned it as well, the majority of the trials are incorporating elements of decentralization. However, the full decentralized clinical trials is a solution, is implemented in a minority of the trials with very specific cases in different therapeutic areas. There are many companies, and you were asking, are companies doing this right now or not, and what have you? The answer is yes, but it's a mixed bag, I would say, in the looking at the large picture of the entire field. Large companies such as Takeda Pharmaceuticals, they have about 33% of the trials being decentralized clinical trials in 2022. Bayer implemented DCTs also in the same year, about 22%. Sanofi is also was using elements of DCT in about 70% of their trials. Vertex is also using these in about 70% of the trial in 2022. This is public data. AbbVie is also trying to work on this. Some of the companies used to have a specific unit dedicated to decentralized clinical trials, and the same happened with the CROs, IQVIA, LabCorp, Perexcel, PPD, Cigna Health. They used to have units dedicated to this, but now the trend is is a mixed bag. Okay, some of them, pharmaceutical CROs, are decentralizing the expertise and spreading the DCT expertise across the therapeutic areas, across their functional areas, so that there is effective dissemination of the DCT expertise across these organizations. there are pros and cons connected to this, but that tells you what the trends are in terms of the adoption internally in these companies, adoption in the field, adoption across therapeutic areas. This is happening, as Anna mentioned, in oncology, in CNS, I would say CNS is happening in cardiovascular diseases, in infectious diseases, in vaccines, in metabolic disorders, and so on and so forth. So it's a broad, wide adoption.
And to your point, which areas do you see strongest adoption?
I mean, I think,
Go ahead.
yeah, I think, well, based off data, it's the neurology. It's like the areas where patients may not want to come in all the time and can't have the flexibility of doing remote assessments. So maybe even areas that digital therapeutics have a bigger role, because or DHT, kind of those wearable and at-home monitoring is under the umbrella of decentralized trials. So any area that uses those technologies would be a huge kind of our area of opportunity for DCTs. Also, with regards to maybe disease states that have like long-term follow-up with multiple specialists looking, where you need to have a marriage of multimodal data from different sources, that DCT would actually foster dialogue and more continuity of care and more holistic approaches versus fragmented data coming in from all different segments of the healthcare system.
Yeah, I would say the same. Also, let's not forget rare diseases. Rare diseases are the textbook example of decentralized clinical trials in many cases, just because of problems with these individuals having diseases in remote communities, or having difficulties connected to mobility or access to the clinical research sites and what have you. And they are far and few in between. So it becomes really an advantage to implement DCT elements in this kind of rare disease ecosystem. Oncology was an area that at the very beginning was not considered by many as an open opportunity for decentralized clinical trials, but time again proved that that is not the case, because oncology trials are also being incorporating elements of decentralization. In the area of immuno-oncology, in which there is a long-term follow-up, many of these follow-up visits can actually follow a DCT decentralized approach. So those are examples of the broad distribution of DCTs across therapeutic areas. And so it's just happening. It's here to continue staying.
Yeah, and by the way, I want to encourage the audience also to submit any questions for Anna and Isaac here through the chat and QA functionality through Zoom. So please feel free. Both of them are happy to also address any specific questions you may have. Of course, we have a lot to discuss today, but want to also make sure that your questions get addressed as well. So speaking of this, you spoke a lot about specific examples of hybrid DCTs versus full DCTs. What are typical technologies and typical components of DCTs that are being used?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So as we kind of alluded to earlier, the field of DCTs is not new. So there's within the kind of toolbox of DCTs, you have old tools and you have newer emerging tools. So the older tools are the eConsents, the eCOAs for sure. And those are definitely the top two right now being implemented still. The newer ones is more at home kind of approaches. So like home health nursing has also been around, but not really utilized in clinical trials until recently during COVID and now after COVID. I am the most excited about the leveraging of local HCP facilities. You saw that being, and this is in the book too, where one example of leveraging local healthcare providers or HCPs is using retail pharmacies. And as a pharmacist myself, working at Walgreens, as you know from DSO for 4 years, I really saw the untapped potential there. I mean, pharmacists are really busy, but we can do so much more. And if you can get reimbursed for all those activities, can really unlock these friction points of care, is how I like to think of it in my head, is a patient that needs a blood pressure or a blood draw do they have to go drive an hour away to the prostate cancer clinic, or can they get it at their local Walgreens within 5 miles away? So I was really hopeful that Walgreens and CVS and Kroger, all those pharmacies, could be one of the tools of these newer type DCT elements. And then in the book, as you know, there's a few exits. So it's not to say it's a setback. It's more of a learning opportunity to see how we can implement meaningful and long-term adoption of these types of approaches and trials. So I feel that retail pharmacies is not the only option for a local healthcare provider, but also potentially the primary oncologist that isn't part of the FDA contract 1572, but can be delegated responsibilities that they're already licensed to perform. So then, and also we know there's a big need for training physicians to become eventually investigators. There's like that learning gap of what clinical research is and what entails really good data collection, good patient management, things like that. And so if you're a research naive physician, you can still be in a clinical research experience being delegated responsibilities from the sub-I or the PI. And through this model, they can learn how a trial works and then eventually become a PI themselves, and then delegate to another local healthcare provider to train as well. So that's a newer type of approach that I'm really excited about, and I'm optimistic can really enable physicians to practice at the top of their license, really invite multiple healthcare provider specialists within a trial, and also just make it easier for trials to get medical care.
So let me switch a little bit the answer, in my opinion, from my perspective to that question, even though you covered it really well, Anna. When I get asked the question about the typical elements of DCTs and what is newer versus more established, I just reply back by saying, and I have gotten that question all the time in the last probably 10 years. So the first one is, there are three elements that we need to think about very carefully to then think about the typical elements of DCTs that could be implemented in a clinical investigation. The first one of them is the trial design. The rigor of the science can now be compromised, and that will dictate what kind of elements can be implemented from the DCT perspective. And that is something that the regulatory agencies will look very carefully into the suitability of that specific trial design for the specific new medical product that is being tested, and to assess safety and efficacy of that medical product in the specific population where the product will be tested. That's number one, and that will never be compromised. The second point is and I say this from my own experience, the second component is the operational component, the logistical operational component. This is what distinguishes decentralized clinical trial approaches from traditional randomized controlled trials. You need to think ahead proactively as to what elements of DCTs truly are effective and represent a solution for the trial that you are going to conduct. So not only the scientific rigor, but operationally, logistically, you are able to conduct this in a decentralized fashion, and that is paramount to the conduct of that trial. And the third element, equally important, not because it's third, it's just a way to mention, is the regulatory framework. The regulatory legal framework will dictate what one sponsor or sponsors or the field at large can and cannot do in terms of the implementation from the operational standpoint for the conduct of clinical trials. This is particularly important when we are dealing with complex trials that are happening not only in one regulatory jurisdiction, but across regulatory jurisdictions. So the regulatory framework, the operational component, and the scientific rigor in trial design are three critical elements that will dictate the elements that will be incorporated in the trial as DCT elements. And Anna mentioned examples of typical elements of DCTs in saying e-consent. Well, so remote patient recruitment and screening is happening thanks to technology. We talked about, and she talked about telehealth and telemedicine in virtual visits. ECOAS, and I mentioned that direct-to-patient investigation and product shipments is something that from the operational standpoint is a must. You need to have continuity in the shipment of the investigational products and on the clinical trial materials that are necessary for the conduct of the trial. The remote data collection, for example, the use of wearables or digital health technologies, and the digital platform that is being utilized or will going to be utilized is critical. It's an elements of decentralization. And as you mentioned, home nurse visits and home health services. Phlebotomies is another example of this. The use of local healthcare providers. Yes, I agree with you. Pharmacists are really a major player in this field. Electronic case report forms is another example. The use of online portals for participants and for the sponsors. And in all of this, yes, we know e-consent is well established. Some of the clinical outcome assessments electronically are well established. Televisits through telehealth is well established. And evidently having a digital platform for data capture, electronic data capture is really critical. What is new in this space? And I talked about this a few years ago, in which I say each clinical investigation will have a digital print or the Digiverse, in which the combination of solutions that are implemented in the trial represents the fingerprint of that trial. And what is yet to be, and where we're going into adoption in terms of the technology, are a continuity of improvements in wearable devices for collection of clinical data, anything connected to artificial intelligence and machine learning percolating the trial at all steps is something that we will continue seeing improvements. The integration of, for example, real-world data into trial designs to complement as a control arm or so, or to inform the implementation of DCT approaches is something that we will continue to see. Patient and trial remote monitoring is going to continue improving. Technologies such as blockchain for data integrity and participant privacy, zero trust approaches for cybersecurity is going to percolate the field. Federated computing is something that will also come to this field. Those are things that are not really regularly implemented, but they will come. And that's why I am so excited to see all of this happening in the years to come. Back to David.
Yeah, it's very important. I mean, there's many different things that you mentioned, many innovations that are happening, many different aspects of the trial that are touched by this. We talked about full DCTs, which are still the exceptions, hybrid DCTs that implement some of these. It's important to note that in order to get started with DCTs, you don't have to implement all of these at once. You want to pick the components that are most meaningful for your specific trial. It's similar to self-driving cars, right? You didn't build a self-driving car out of the gate. It was something that came in steps. So you had cruise control, you had brake assistant, lane holding assistant, and at some point you had Waymo. But it took quite a lot of regulatory conversations and technology advancements in order to get there. So it is true also for trials. Everybody can now, in my opinion, use DCT methodologies in their trials. I believe that probably goes without exception. I'm probably biased because we are the HT that is being used in a decentralized form in trials. So what we see is always has some components of DCTs in there. So a little bit biased. We do have a question here from the audience, and that's actually, I think, for Anna about your comment on using, for example, pharmacies or the local health provider for outsourcing some of the responsibilities of the traditional clinical sites and the specific reliability of data that is being collected in what the commenter here said is an uncontrolled or less controlled environment. And so how do you assure that the data, is still following the same principles, that it's clean, reliable, and provided then to the site in integral form.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to piggyback off your car example, it's like you also have setbacks too, where you can put a cone on top of the cruise car and it just shuts off completely. So every field that has innovation will have some interesting learnings too that, so it's just very fun to see the evolution and also be humble to learn things I didn't expect to learn along the way. So great question from Nabil. I did see this come through. I think there's two answers to this question about the data coming in from these uncontrolled environments. From my experience, and it's just my own experience, working with these types of setups, is you have either the data coming in be immediately kind of transferred to the sub-I. So like the local site doesn't actually do any of the cleaning. They just collect it and they send it away. And then it's up to the responsibility of the sub-I or PI to really ensure that it's up to their standard because they're the one responsible for the submission and the quality and the rigor of all that. The other kind of way to do it is the site will not transfer it. So there's an interesting approach by a vendor that actually the sub-I will dial live into this visit at the local facility. And then the local facility is the eyes, ears, nose, throat of the patient, of the kind of managing physician. And then during the appointment, the data is actually entered immediately like into that overall system. So there's no temporary kind of storage of the data anywhere in these uncontrolled environments. So both work. I think the main point is to ensure that the person on the contract, so the sub-I or the PI, is the one ensuring rigor of the data collected. And then there's a question around transferring too. So some pharmacies that I had worked with only did paper, so they wanted to take a picture of it and then fax it over. So that's something that, we have to meet people where they are. So if that's their system, as long as it's through our standards and our privacy processes, then let's make it happen. Ideally, you don't want to use paper. You want to use something with some sort of stamp of electronic approval and security, and then immediately dip that over to the main site. So hopefully that answered your question, and thank you for the question.
Let me add a couple of things to complement what you said, considering that I also have conducted multiple clinical trials, DCTs, globally. In what the the colleague asking the question said, uncontrolled environments. So when you are going to design and operationalize a decentralized clinical trial, hybrid full, or hybrid with decentralized elements, to be precise, there are at least three considerations to keep in mind. The first one is, and this has to be done from the very early on design, the patient journey, from the beginning until the end, what that journey is going to be like. Simultaneous to that is the data flow, the communications flow, the adverse event reports, the safety report, communications, so the data flow from end to end. The third component is the trial supply, medical supplies, and the medical product supplies. Those three journeys will actually dictate all of the changes and nuances that can be experienced in a decentralized clinical trial. What is defined as an uncontrolled environment is actually a controlled environment per the clinical investigation. And that is controlled because it's following a clinical trial protocol, is following SOPs for the implementation of the trial at the specific place, and is following specific timelines, and is conducted under specific regulatory guidance framework and legal framework. So it is known that there is and there might be variability of the data in a decentralized clinical trial, data collected decentralized compared to data collected centrally. The question here is, did you account as a sponsor for that variability early on in trial design? Did you implement mitigating approaches to minimize the data variability? Did you estimate the data variability in the statistical plan and how that is accounted for so that there is still viability of that clinical investigation? I'm just giving you all a sense of the kind of things that we faced early on. And that's why I say the skill set is a bit different compared to just conducting a randomized control trial at the site. You need to account for all of these journeys, for the flow of information, for the patient journey, for the medical supply chain, and interconnect them to make sure that you uncover things that can happen along the way.
Yeah, thank you very much. This extra context, Isaac, and we have only 5 minutes left, unfortunately. So I want to encourage, if there's any questions from the audience, please do share them with us ASAP, because we have a couple of other things that I wanted to cover. So let's be relatively brief. There's one thing I wanted to really ask you about the specific impact also on the bottom line, the return on investment, so to speak. We have the similar conversation right now with the Digital Medicine Society about the use of digital outcome measures in clinical trials, where, okay, you need to convince the research team to use them for all sorts of reasons that you brought up just now, but you also have to convince the actual financial department of your sponsors that this makes sense also financially. So what sort of measures have been used in the past to show actually the return on investment, and do you have any examples for how that was shown?
Yeah, I'll take that. So we've been doing non-financial ROI for our leadership, which has gained good traction and buy-in for additional support of DCTs in the future. We've showed when you add on DCT approaches across 2 hybrid trials, you saw each trial had a brick and mortar approach and then a decentralized approach. You were able to boost the enrollment rate by 5 times. And this is one in rare disease, and the other one was non-interventional, but it was also an underserved population. And then for the inclusion of patients, we were able to enroll more of those in a rural setting, a micropolitan setting, kind of away from those hubs. So that was really cool to see. And then cost-wise, or I guess protocol deviations-wise, there was not any more.
5 times, right? 5 times.
Yes.
That is really remarkable.
It is, yeah. And it was very promising to see, and it was just in those small studies, but it gained enough kind of appetite for us to continue exploring the approaches. So actually that kind of project then unlocked another project internally to look at even more trials. So now 10 trials to look at in the past, what is the Roche experience on adding DCT elements in these trials. So that's been exciting. I was going to say something else around ROI. Oh, and then there's also emerging research. So I'm part of the Tufts Pact, which is the Partnership for Advancing Clinical Trials. And through that, one of their research questions was looking at broad inclusion of ethnic minorities. And it seems like right now it's not an immediate kind of benefit for enrolling underserved African-American, Hispanic populations, but you do actually enroll more Asian American populations, which is interesting. And so without compromising the enrollment of white Caucasian populations too. So more evidence to come, but I think that's how we're proving ROI right now.
And that leads me to my last question, and I want to ask both of you to give me your opinion about what's to come. So how do you think in the next 3 to 5 years will the DCC landscape emerge?
So let me add 1 second here to the previous question. There are multiple ways of analyzing the return on investment, and I gave you examples. And every organization is setting up their own metrics to measure the return on investments. One example is to use, for example, the net present value modeling, or the ENPV, and that assesses the financial impact of DCTs by comparing the cash flows with and without the DCT methods, and is calculating the increment of the net present value when DCTs methods are employed. That's one parameter. You can define return on investments based on the ratio of increment in the ENVP to the DCT implementation cost. There can be benchmark comparisons of performance outcomes. For example, comparing traditional in-person trials with those using DCT methodologies. And there are really multiple analyses that can be done from the financial aspect connected to this, and the resource and the capital and all of this.
That's very similar.
Going forward,
with
It's an exciting field, is growing, as I mentioned, technology enabled, more sophistication, more innovation is to come, more diversification of the skill set, more consumerization and innovative patient approach incorporated, more diversification in the therapeutic areas, and working together more collaboratively, everyone in this field. Anna, back to you.
Ditto. No, that's great. I can't really add more. It's just that it's an exciting time. And I think that what's next to come is more people getting involved, and especially working with our field partners even too, identifying sites and physicians and kind of working together to bring this model to life. So that's it. Thank you for having us, DSO.
Well,
Thank
you
you
so much, Anna and Isaac, for spending an hour with me today. I want to encourage everybody in the audience to order the book, to get more information about what we talked about here today. And thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll touch base later.
Connect with us in LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you.